Let's be clear from the start. Guilt is not a holy virtue, and shame is not a sign of goodness. They are deceptions, illusions of the mind rooted in fear. You've been taught that feeling guilty proves you have a conscience, that it makes you a good person, but that teaching is a lie. In truth, guilt is not divine at all. It's a trick of the ego, a clever cage built to keep you small and suffering. Think about it. How many nights have you lain awake, replaying your mistakes, whispering in agony, "Why did I do that? What's wrong with me?" You wear your guilt like chains around your heart, hoping that if you punish yourself enough, you'll somehow atone. Yet deep down, haven't you noticed? No amount of guilt has ever really liberated you. It has only weighed you down. It doesn't make you kinder, it makes you anxious and self-hating. It doesn't make you wiser. It clouds your judgment with self-doubt. So if guilt isn't actually helping you, why do you cling to it? You cling to it because you were conditioned to. Since childhood, society has slipped this shackle on you. Shame on you, they scolded when you made a mistake, as if feeling bad is the way to become good. Parents, teachers, religious leaders, many of them genuinely believed that guilt would correct you. If you felt awful enough about a bad deed, maybe you'd never do it again. And so you internalized this. Whenever you fall short, you should feel guilt. You should drown yourself in regret. You should suffer as penance. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Guilt was never about making you better. It was about making you obedient. It's a learned emotion designed to control you, not to liberate you. A person riddled with guilt is pliable. They'll police themselves. They'll stay in line. Guilt became the invisible leash on your soul. You don't step too far out of society's comfort zone, because if you do, the guilt will whip you back into place. And the ego, that fearful voice in your head, it loves this arrangement. Your ego uses guilt and shame as weapons to maintain its identity and control. It tells you that you are your mistakes, that any wrong steps means you're a bad person, unworthy of love. This voice is harsh, critical, relentless. It masquerades as your conscience, and it's not coming from the divine part of you at all. It's the voice of all your fear. Fear of not being enough, fear of rejection, fear of divine punishment. In truth, it's the voice of ego conditioning, echoing all the scolding and judging you've absorbed in your life. In contrast, the voice of your soul sounds completely different. The soul's voice never condemns. It corrects with passion. It guides with love, not with fear. Where the ego shouts, "You screwed up, you should be ashamed," the soul says gently, "You made a mistake. You're not aligning with who you really are. Let's learn from this and choose differently." The soul doesn't whip you with guilt. It bathes you in awareness. Awareness of consequences, yes. Awareness of the pain caused, perhaps. But also awareness that a mistake does not define you. Neale Donald Walsch, in Conversations with God, brings this distinction to light in a way that can feel like a bucket of cold water, shocking yet awakening. At one point, Walsh expresses, "Sometimes I feel so guilty," and the response he receives from the divine is startling. Guilt and fear are the only enemies of man. Read that again. Not sin and evil, but fear and guilt are our great enemies. Why? Because they are the illusions that keep us from the truth. They are the mechanisms by which we torture ourselves and others. They do not come from God. They are not love. They are enemies to your soul. Consider what that implies. Your only enemies in life are not out there somewhere, not some lurking devils, but the fear and guilt within you. These are what truly undermine your happiness and growth. Walsh goes further, relaying that God says, "There is no such thing as wrong. There is only that which does not serve you, does not speak the truth about who you are and who you choose to be." In other words, from the soul's perspective, wrong is not an absolute moral condemnation the way we usually think of it. It simply means you took an action that didn't express your highest self. It wasn't bad, as in you're now damned. It was just off the mark of who you really want to be. And if it doesn't serve you, you have the power to choose again. Yet guilt would have you believe that your missteps mean you are inherently flawed or unworthy. Guilt keeps you stuck in the feeling that you are something less than divine. Walsh writes bluntly that guilt is the feeling that keeps you stuck in who you are not. Ponder that. Who you are not. When you wallow in guilt, you identify with the part of you that acted out of character, out of fear. You start to believe that is who you are. I lied, so I'm a liar. I hurt someone, so I'm a hurtful, bad person. The ego delights in these labels because they trap you in a narrative of unworthiness. But that narrative is a lie. It's who you are not. The guilt ensures you don't forget that false identity. It is truly a deception. Even Neale Donald Walsch himself was not immune to this deception. Before he wrote Conversations with God, his life was in shambles. He went through a series of devastating blows. A fire burned down everything he owned. His marriage fell apart, and a car accident broke his neck. He ended up homeless, living in a tent and scavenging just to eat. Imagine the weight of guilt and failure he must have felt. By his own account, he was despondent, convinced that he had ruined his life. He thought it was all over. In those moments, he surely asked himself, "What did I do wrong to deserve this? How have I failed so badly?" The ego was right there with him, telling him he was a shameful failure, that life was punishing him for his mistakes. We've all felt some version of this, haven't we? Maybe not to the extreme of living in a tent, but the feeling of life collapsing, the relationship you destroyed, the career opportunity you squandered, the person you hurt deeply. In those darkest nights of the soul, guilt feels like the only companion. It sits on your chest and whispers that you're beyond redemption. Neale Donald Walsch sat in that dark place, and from that place of despair, he cried out in anger and sorrow, writing an anguished letter to God. Why? Why is my life such a mess? What have I done to deserve this? It was the voice of guilt, of self-blame, finally crying for help. And help came, but not in the form he expected. Walsh experienced a moment of divine dialogue. A voice, gentle yet powerful, emerged in his consciousness. It wasn't the voice of his scolding ego. It was something else. It said to him, among many things, "On purpose, you must learn to be gentle with yourself and stop judging yourself." Everything that had happened in his life, all the chaos and mistakes, had happened on purpose, perfectly arranged for his soul's growth. The message from God was clear. Stop beating yourself up. Stop with the guilt, the self-condemnation. Be gentle. Can you imagine? In the pit of his guilt and shame, to be told that there was no need to judge himself at all? This was a revelation that turned his world upside down. If even in our worst moments God does not judge us, then why do we insist on judging ourselves? Walsh had to confront the possibility that everything he believed about guilt and punishment was flawed, that perhaps God's love was so unconditional that all the guilt he'd been carrying was not required, not useful, not truth. Maybe, just maybe, guilt was never justice, but just pain. And perhaps healing could come only from another way, through self-forgiveness and understanding. The contrast between the ego's voice and the soul's voice became crystal clear. The ego, conditioned by society and fear, screams for guilt and punishment. The soul, an expression of the divine within, whispers for correction and love. One voice chains you to the past, the other frees you into your future. Ask yourself, the last time you felt crushing guilt, did that feeling actually help anyone? Did berating yourself in your mind undo what happened, or did it just paralyze you from moving forward? You likely ended up stuck, drowning in self-loathing. Now imagine, instead, that you had met your mistake with honest awareness. Yes, I see that I caused pain. This isn't who I wish to be. How can I make this right, or at least ensure I grow from this? No hysteria, no whipping yourself, just conscious understanding. That path is open to you right now. and it is the path your soul wants to take. In fact, Walsh notes that in highly evolved societies more spiritually advanced than our own, there is no concept of guilt at all. If someone errs or fails, the community simply observes it and asks that person to adjust their behavior. The individual is encouraged to recognize the mismatch between their action and their true intent, and to correct it. No one is shamed or condemned. They aren't asked to do what they can't do, and they aren't made to suffer for missteps. As a result, there is no lingering guilt, no festering shame. Imagine living like that. Every mistake simply an opportunity to learn and realign, without the emotional torment we've come to assume is natural. That is what the voice of the soul guides us toward. The voice of the ego would call this heresy. It tells you if you don't feel guilty, you'll never learn. If you don't punish yourself, you will repeat the sin. But the evidence of our lives says otherwise. Guilt doesn't stop the cycle. If anything, it perpetuates it. People filled with guilt often sabotage themselves into committing the same mistakes, as if unconsciously seeking confirmation that they're as bad as they feel. Or they become so demoralized, they lose the strength to change. Awareness and love are far more effective teachers. When you deeply understand the impact of your action, awareness, and still hold yourself in the energy of love, you naturally incline toward healing the damage and making better choices. There is no fear or self-hatred in that state, only clarity and compassion. As Neale Donald Walsch succinctly put it, awareness is not guilt, and love is not fear. Fear and guilt, he reiterates, are your only enemies, while love and awareness are your true friends. In other words, feeling guilty is not the same as being aware, and being afraid of punishment is not the same as choosing love. The former pair, guilt-fear, will cripple you. The latter, awareness-love, will uplift you. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a choice. Perhaps one of the most important choices you will ever make on your spiritual journey. The choice to release guilt. If guilt truly is a deception of the ego, a self-imposed prison, then the door to that prison has always been unlocked. You can walk out any time. The ego will scream that you can't, that you must stay and serve your sentence. But the soul beckons you to step out into the light of freedom. Walsh shares a beautiful, simple truth from his conversation with God about this. If you release guilt, guilt will release you. How do you do that? By deciding to. By deciding to. It almost sounds too easy, doesn't it? But consider that for a moment. Releasing guilt is an act of will, a decision to no longer indulge in self-punishment. This doesn't mean that with a snap of your fingers all feelings of remorse vanish instantly. It means you consciously commit to a new perspective. You catch yourself when you spiral into that familiar pit of shame and say, "No, I have felt enough guilt. It does not serve me or anyone. I choose to let this go now." You may have to make that decision many times a day at first, but each time you do, you strengthen the soul's voice over the ego's. Now let's address a common fear. If I let go of guilt, won't I become irresponsible? Won't I be free to do awful things without remorse? This is another deception of fear. Releasing guilt is not the same as releasing responsibility. In fact, it's the opposite. When you are no longer drowning in guilt, you can take true responsibility for your actions. Guilt is paralyzing. It traps you in self-hatred, which often leads to denial or avoidance because facing what happened hurts too much. But without guilt toxicity, you can clearly acknowledge what you did, make amends sincerely, and change your behavior. Responsibility flows naturally from a clear heart, not a self-flagellating one. Letting go of guilt also does not mean you forget your lessons. It means you finally learn the lesson and move on, instead of compulsively repeating the lesson by keeping yourself in a state of suffering. Some people actually become addicted to guilt, believing on some level that their suffering atones for their wrongs. But in truth, that's just ego trying to earn worthiness through martyrdom. You don't need to earn worthiness. You are already worthy. Your soul's worth was never in question. Only your actions were out of alignment. Fix the alignment, but don't attack your worth. When you decide to see yourself through the eyes of the soul, you begin to understand that you are not defined by your lowest moments. You are an evolving being. Yes, you have made choices that you regret. Perhaps you've hurt people, including yourself. The proper response is to feel remorse, a conscious sorrow for the harm done, and a resolve to make it right, and then to transform that energy into action or change. But remorse is not the same as guilt. Remorse says, that action was not in line with who I want to be. I can do better. Guilt says, I'm garbage because of what I did. I'll never be good. One is productive, the other destructive. Healing does not come from guilt or self-punishment. It comes from remembering your divine identity and choosing again. This bears repeating because it's the heart of the matter. Remember who you really are and choose again. Remember that you are a child of God, an expression of the divine. In conversations with God, God reminds us over and over that we are one with Him, that we are essentially good, that we are loved beyond measure. When you truly internalize that, even for a moment, you remember your divine identity. You remember that nothing you can do will ever separate you from the love of God, except perhaps your own belief that you're unworthy of it. And that belief is exactly what guilt reinforces. Walsh learned that God never left him, even at his lowest. God wasn't punishing him with those hardships. In fact, God was right there within him, waiting for Neale to turn inward and listen. And when Neale did, what did God say? Not, yes, you screwed up, you're a terrible person. No, God said, effectively, I love you. I have always loved you. Stop fearing me. There is nothing to fear. In one passage, God says to Neale, it was only when you stopped fearing me that you could create any kind of meaningful relationship with me. That line hits deep. As long as you're afraid of God or see God as something wrathful, you cannot truly approach God. And what causes that fear of God in the first place? Often it's guilt. The belief that God must be angry with you for your imperfections. So releasing guilt isn't just about feeling better emotionally. It's about spiritual intimacy. It opens the doorway to a closer relationship with the divine. When you no longer project your self-judgment onto God, you experience God as the pure love that He, She, It is. You start to feel God not as a distant figure, but as an upwelling presence in your own heart. The communion with God that your soul craves becomes possible because you are no longer running away and hiding in the shadows of shame. Imagine, for a moment, living without that burden of guilt. Who would you be? How would you feel? It might scare you even to consider it, because you've identified with your guilt for so long. It's become like an old security blanket, threadbare and painful, but familiar. Without guilt, you might feel oddly exposed or empty at first, as you let yourself be light and free. But that empty space is quickly filled with something else. Peace, a profound sense of peace that comes from self-acceptance. In that peace, you can finally hear the true voice of your conscience, not the rabid dog of guilt, but the true conscience which is aligned with your soul. It will whisper to you about what's right, how to make amends, how to grow, but always with love. You'll find that you care more deeply about doing what's right when you love yourself than you ever did when you hated yourself. Self-hatred never made you kinder to others. It only made you obsessed with your own failing. Self-love, however, spills over. When you forgive yourself, it becomes so much easier to forgive others. When you stop judging yourself so cruelly, you naturally stop judging others as well. This is the alchemy of the soul. As within, so without. Releasing guilt is a key that unlocks so many other gifts. Self-love, for one. Perhaps the hardest love to give is the one to yourself, especially when you have a list of perceived sins and shortcomings. But when you drop that list and burn it, you realize you're as deserving of love as any other being in the universe. You can finally look into the mirror and not immediately recount all the things you've done wrong, but see the divine spark in your own eyes. You can tell yourself, I am worthy, I am forgiven. In fact, I always was. I just needed to realize it. With that comes freedom. Freedom from the past. Freedom to live fully in the present. You're no longer dragging the heavy ball and chain of yesterday's guilt into today. Spiritual clarity returns to you. You can discern what your next step should be without the fog of self-loathing blinding you. And perhaps most beautifully, you feel closer to God than ever before, because you finally align with the truth that God's love was never withdrawn. It was you who withdrew from it, wrapping yourself in guilt because you thought you had to. Now, having put guilt aside, you stand in the open, arms wide, face turned into the heavens, and you feel the warmth of the divine pouring into you like sunshine. It was always there. You simply had to stop blocking it. This is the redemptive arc that guilt was hiding from you all along. Redemption was never about suffering until you've earned God's mercy. Mercy was always there. Redemption is about finally seeing yourself through God's eyes and thus transforming how you live. It's about saying, I'm not my mistakes. I am not my past. I am an aspect of God, capable of growth and goodness, and I choose to embody that now. No fanfare needed, no self-flagellation, just a quiet, resolute return to the truth. So I ask you now, in this moment, as if it's just you and me and no one else can hear your answer. Who would you be without your guilt? If you set it down, what new person could rise from beneath it? Could it be that the only thing ever holding you back was the belief that you deserve to be held back? Reflect on this deeply. Feel the weight you've been carrying, and then imagine what it would be like. Drop it. Yes, there may be tears, tears of relief, tears of releasing. Let them flow. That is the feeling of your soul coming back to life, no longer smothered by ego's deception. Guilt was a teacher, but a false one. You don't need it anymore. You never truly did. Love and awareness are far more superior teachers, and they have been patiently waiting for you to remember them. Now you know. Now you see the truth about guilt. It is not divine. It's an illusion born of fear, used to control and limit you. And now you also know the truth about yourself. You are a divine being, worthy of all the love in the universe, growing and evolving through each choice you make. When you know that, guilt has no more power over you. It's time to step out of the shadow of guilt and into the light of your own soul. It's time to choose love instead of fear. It's time to release those chains. They were never locked anyway. Walk forward now, unburdened, introspective, but empowered. Feel that liberation in your bones. This is your true state. This is your birthright to be free, to be whole, and to be in loving communion with yourself and with God. The deception of guilt dissolves here, in the light of this understanding. You are free. Now go, live as the free being you were always meant to be. Embrace yourself with the same compassion God has eternally given you, and experience the profound clarity and peace that comes with knowing you are guiltless, you are loved, and you are one with God.